And we're live. What's up, everybody? Hold on, let me just tag Triggernometry on Twitter, and then we'll get this thing on the road. Cool. Sugar Pod. You know, I wasn't planning on streaming today, but then I saw this dropped, and I'm going to be traveling for the next few days in the West Bank, the beautiful Judea and Samaria, Palestine. So I figured let's do this review, because as those who know this program know that I've done a fair bit of debunking of John Spencer, as well as Andrew Fox. They've both been on Triggernometry lately, and it's unfortunate because there's a lot of misinformation, and I genuinely believe that most misinformation is spread unintentionally. It's people spreading things that they believe is true, that they want to believe is true, but they don't know what they're spreading is false. When it comes to people like John Spencer and Andrew Fox, I actually genuinely believe that they are intentionally misleading the public. And that's just because they promote all sorts of false claims that even when pointed out to them repeatedly that they're false, they continue to double down and make these claims. And then there have been instances where they seem to eventually have understood that these claims are false, so they stop making them, but they never issue public corrections. One of the biggest ones when it comes to John Spencer is he used to say that the civilian to combatant ratio in all urban warfare is 9-1. I actually heard Constantine make a similar claim in a video he did. There's no basis for that. It's around 1.5-1, 2-1, that's the range. And the other claim is that the civilian to combatant ratio in Gaza is 1-1. There's no basis for that either, and we actually know it's much higher. So I think John doesn't make those claims anymore because he knows they're not true, but he never came out and issued a public correction, right? So it's frustrating when you have these authority figures. They're authority figures because they're military and ex-military, so they're seen as authority figures. And the people who are pro-Israel want to believe what they're saying is true. The establishment that's pro-Israel wants to believe that they're true, so they're propped up and given immense legitimacy, even though they spread constant massive amounts of misinformation without even an attempt for accuracy. And we'll get into it. I didn't watch this video. I just know if it's an hour long with John Spencer, I know for certain it's just going to be riddled with misinformation because that's what he's all about. And you know, Constantine and Francis, if y'all happen to see this, I'd love to have a conversation with you guys. I'm Israeli. I'm living here in Israel. I served in the IDF. I've researched this conflict and Gaza specifically immensely. I'm here on the streets getting roughed up by police. I have a lot of skin in the game. I'm not your typical Israel hater. I'm not trying to destroy the state. I'm not trying to harm the people living here. I care immensely for all people living on this land, and I'm looking for a just solution. So if y'all are looking for a different, just a completely different perspective from a lot of the people you've been hosting, I would love to speak to you guys. I know I'm not a big name like many of the people you bring on, but I do want to put it out there and let you know that I'd love to speak to you guys. Cool. Let's get into this. And again, sometimes when I do these, I call them reviews, but I call this a debunking because I know it's going to be a debunking. I just know that's what it's going to be. So let's do this. Okay. We'll put it on 1.5 speed. If you're watching this after the fact, you can slow it down.
John Spencer, welcome to Triggernometry.
Well, thanks for having me. Long-time viewer, long-time fan.
Well, appreciate that. You're one of the world's leading experts on urban combat and urban warfare, which is why we wanted to have you on in the context of what's happening in Gaza. Obviously, you messaged me somewhat irate after our last couple of interviews on Israel with Piers Morgan and Andrew Fox. You had a lot of disagreements. Before we get into all of that...
Okay, that's interesting. I'm actually excited to hear the disagreements between Fox and John Spencer. I could guess that Andrew Fox has started to say that we need to end the war in Gaza. It's no longer serving Israel. He's starting to go against what Netanyahu is saying. my guess would be that is their area of disagreement. John Spencer wants to continue and even escalate, and he says that's the only way to deal with them. So I'd be interested to see his disagreements with Piers Morgan. Those are obvious.
And your perspective on what's happening and perhaps answering some of the questions that those two guests raised that we as non-experts are not able to address. Tell everybody a little about your background and what gives you the ability to talk about these issues with some authority.
Sure. So my name is John Spencer. I'm the chair of Urban Warfare Studies at the Majesty Policy Forum, also executive director of the Urban Warfare Institute. I spent 25 years active duty U.S. Army as an infantry soldier and then officer, 2 combat tours to Iraq, did the invasion, and then I was there during the height of the sectarian violence in 2008 in Baghdad to include the Battle of Sadr City. I don't rest on my own experiences, though. I've been studying urban warfare for over a decade. I started in the Pentagon, actually in a research group and advisory role to our top 4-star general of the U.S. Army in the Pentagon. After that tour, where we were looking at large cities like megacities, I moved to West Point, the United States Military Academy, where I was teaching strategy, leadership, military tactics in echelon. But really, that strategy class has helped me a lot since then. I started a research center called the Modern War Institute. I was a co-founder of that. I started writing a lot about urban warfare. Now I have 3 books. I started a podcast, although I don't consider myself a podcaster, not that that's a bad thing. I've been doing it for over 6 years, interviewing top commanders of past battles, technical experts, veterans. I've started in the research role, though, since 2018, really. I've been traveling the world, going into combat zones, using different research methodologies like ethnographic, basically getting on the ground in combat areas and recording what's happening, and then the lessons that other people can take from it. So I write case studies on past wars. So I've covered most urban battles of the past, from Stalingrad to most of the battles of World War II. Actual walking the ground of battlegrounds. I went into Ukraine weeks after Russia withdrew from Kyiv and been into Ukraine 4 times, Azerbaijan to study their wars, India, and then Israel, of course. So I've been to Israel now 5 times, 4 times, embedded with the IDF, actually with the commanders, with the division commanders and others. I've interviewed the prime minister 3 times, the defense minister, the head of the IDF, the chief of staff, numerous commanders, observed them in the field. And I didn't start studying war on October 7th. And that's unique in some aspects to other people who have opinions. I didn't start studying Israel on October 7th, and I surely heck didn't start studying war. I had been going in and out of Israel for years, writing case studies, writing research reports on their past urban battles, from the 1973 Battle of Suez City, the First Intifada, Second Intifada, ancient Jerusalem battle, etc. So I consider myself knowledgeable in urban warfare, but to be honest, in order to understand Gaza, you have to understand a little bit of history on what's come before, and I've studied a lot of urban battles, and I can help provide people like, it's really weird what you're saying about Israel here and all the double standards, but you also have to have an understanding of things like civilian harm mitigation, which are the steps that militaries have taken even over the last 20 or 30 years to protect civilians. And I've been arguing with groups in the United Nations. I've spoken multiple times at the United Nations and with UN humanitarian groups about how do you help protect civilians in urban warfare, but also the law. So then you have that part where you have to understand the full nature of the laws of war, from what is the humanitarian requirements of the attacker to like what munitions can you and can you not use. And I've been writing, podcasting, and researching all those topics. So I think I have some information to share about what's going on in Gaza, but also to give people the framework, because we have a lot of people that say things either that are just wrong, and we can talk about some of those people, or just...
Yeah, I mean, John's one of those people that says things that's just wrong. We'll get into it. Actually, let's start with one, because he says he studied all these wars. He would often cite Mosul as having a higher civilian to combatant ratio than Gaza. I think he made the claim it's 3-to-1 or 4-to-1. But what he failed to mention repeatedly is that 1/3 of fatalities in Mosul were by ISIS just going on a killing spree. He attributed those deaths to the U.S. So was this an honest mistake, or was he intentionally misleading? I'm not sure. But he's essentially, threw the U.S. under the bus, inflating the civilian to combatant ratio, making it seem like the U.S. acted more aggressively and with less care for civilians in Mosul by attributing ISIS fatalities to the U.S. And I don't hear him make that claim anymore. So I think probably it's another one of those claims someone pointed out to him. So now he knows it's false. But he doesn't. He never went on the record correcting it. He was parroting this for months, talking about Mosul. He was completely wrong about it. He never went on the record correcting it. So with all his research, he did get this one wrong. And integrity means, yeah, we all get things wrong sometimes, right? But if you have integrity, then you make a public correction, especially if you're a big platform and a thought leader.
That are not informed by an actually research methodology.
Well, it's great to have you on the show because of your knowledge and expertise. I was going to say, I'm surprised how much hair you have, given that you've probably been tearing a lot of it out with the way that this conflict's been covered. So broad perspective, big picture, in your opinion, what is the correct frame and way of looking at what's happening in Gaza and Israel's war in Gaza that people who don't understand military conflict, particularly urban warfare, probably don't understand?
Absolutely. It's an amazing first question. The framework is war, right? So although Hamas is a non-state actor, the law of war actually covers an international armed conflict or a non-international armed conflict. And I know you had Natasha Hallsdorf to try to explain the framework of the legal. What the world has been doing, though, has been applying a counterterrorism, counterinsurgency framework to Hamas, because there's a heuristic of, this is what people know. This is whether they understand Iraq, Afghanistan, the battles against ISIS. They keep considering Hamas a terrorist fight, a counterterrorism fight. And that's not the framework. That's not in any way the framework. On October 7th, the terror army that was Hamas's military and other terrorist groups and a whole lot of civilians from Gaza invaded southern Israel. Israel waged war in accordance with the framework of nations against Hamas as the political and military apparatus of the area of Gaza. Although it's not a nation, so this isn't a nation-on-nation conflict. It's a nation against a non-state actor, but also very unique in the context of it, unlike others, right? All these other frameworks that people talk about, and this is really where I've been playing whack-a-mole to people's analogies, people's comparisons, is like, why are you comparing this to Iraq battles? Why are you comparing this to ISIS battles? I mean, those are all insurgencies within nations where the U.S. or others are helping.
I mean, he's one of the people who was comparing it to Iraq battles. So I think here's what happened. He used to compare it to Iraq battles, and then he understood that the civilian combatant ratio and just the rate at which civilians are being killed in Gaza is significantly higher. So now he's saying you can't compare it to that, right? So we actually have seen a shift in some of the pro-Israel arguments from going to these completely false claims that best civilian combatant ratio in history, and to kind of dropping that aside and now just saying, well, Hamas this, Hamas that, and that's why we're seeing these numbers. But they're still casting doubt and obfuscating the numbers, which we could get a pretty good estimate on. But they definitely changed the narrative from trying to make the claim saying they're operating in the best way possible with the lowest numbers possible, and then they just they completely, they shifted to a different argument because they understood that talking about numbers is just not defensible based on the data we have.
Even a host nation fight an insurgency, it's the wrong framework. So at the very top is war. You have to frame it in the way of war. Now, how do people compare it? And I can give you all kinds of comparisons that you probably haven't heard of that are more applicable to Gaza than anybody else is using. And it's crazy. And I've tried to help people understand that from the size of the military, the terrain of Gaza, there are some very unprecedented aspects of this where there is no comparison. And I can make really bold claims. I'm sure we'll talk about them. Like, this has never happened in war before.
So explain all of this, John. What are you talking about? What makes this conflict unique? What are some of the particular challenges that the Israeli Defense Force faces? What are some of the contentious issues that people keep claiming that you don't agree with?
Well, I don't know if we have enough time to go through all the contentious
Let's
issues.
try.
So the number one things, let's talk about the things that are unique in war. Gaza. Gaza is a very unique situation. Hamas. So unlike any other comparison, Gaza is a small area, relatively. It's 25 miles long. And sorry, I don't do the kilometers. 25 miles long, 5 to 7 miles wide. It's a relatively small area, but it actually has 24 cities. It has multiple cities of over 600,000, if not a million. Talking about Gaza City. It's not a battle. It's a war. But I can't find any other situation, again, because I've studied urban warfare for over a decade, and I have a little military service myself, where the enemy, defender, has prepared the ground for 20 years for that battle. Most urban battles, from Stalingrad to Aachen.
He's definitely right about this, that Hamas has had decades to prepare, and they've prepared themselves in a way that nobody before them has been able to prepare. And it does pose a new set of challenges that no military has had to deal with, which we'll get into this, but which is why Israel's approach has been disastrous and, in my opinion, indefensible, because of the approach they took given Hamas's preparation. And I'm sure we'll have an opportunity to get more into that soon.
To weigh all of these things are meeting engagements where the enemy gets inside the urban area or is there and then for a short amount of time prepares it for a battle. And we can talk about some of the numbers of previous battles, but the fact that Hamas spent billions of dollars and prepared every bit of Gaza for war is unique. And that means if you're an attacker, again, if you just take the word Israel out of this and give the context of the war, there is no parallel. There's no parallel to the 300 to 400 miles of tunnels underneath every urban area in Gaza and connecting them all. There are tunnels around the world, and I've studied the Vietnam War from the tunnels of Cu Chi to the tunnels currently in North Korea and China. Nobody's ever built 300 miles of tunnels underneath their civilians for the sole purpose of using their civilians as a shield and as a sacrifice. That's their strategy. And I know other people have talked to you about that, is that Hamas wants its population to be killed. That's also unique. The Nazis didn't do that. The Japanese didn't do that.
So here he's making some problematic claims. In a sense, Hamas definitely benefits from PR when civilians are killed. That's not the same as the claim that we often hear, as they're doing their best to maximize civilian harm. This is a claim that's made with no basis, no evidence, that has yet to been proven. I'm waiting for somebody to actually tell me what is this based on. And I would say it's similar to Israel, right? People say Israel's trying to maximize civilian harm, but in reality, it's just a callous indifference towards civilians. Same with Hamas. They're not trying to maximize their civilian harm. It's a callous indifference. They don't care if their civilians die. Now, the thing with the tunnels, Hamas building a tunnel city is not meant to put their civilians in more harm's way. That's actually them separating themselves from Gazan civilians. Think about it. Other instances of an urban insurgency, they need to use civilian infrastructure. They need to be in buildings that are above ground. they're not going to be in an open field, right? The whole point of guerrilla warfare and an insurgency is to use, if it's urban warfare, it's to use buildings. So all urban insurgency, they're literally using civilian buildings. Hamas doesn't need to do that. In fact, they're safer underground. So out of all the instances of urban warfare, Hamas has been able to separate themselves to a greater extent than other instances. Now, this does pose a challenge for Israel because you can't blow up the tunnels without blowing up what's on top of it. So that's true. There's human beings in between them and the tunnels, but they're separated from the tunnels. So it's not true that this is using civilians as human shields to a greater extent than other instances of urban warfare. They're actually separated. And the fact that they're separated gives you a different set of options that you could deal with, which is engaging in some kind of tunnel warfare or doing massive evacuations and then dealing with the infrastructure afterwards, neither of which Israel's really done. What Israel did was use record levels of brute force, of just massive air bombardments on a very densely populated city without proper evacuations while Hamas has someplace to hide. It's an especially preposterous strategy considering the fact that Hamas is under tunnels. The only people who don't have where to go are civilians. So this whole framing that, now again, it's true, it's a challenge for Israel, but this is not the use of human shields. This is building a city underneath Gaza, and there's ways Israel could deal with that. There's no easy way, but there are ways Israel could deal with that. But what they decided to do was brute force and essentially level the city on top of the civilian population. And Fahed, who's here in the comments, who lives in Gaza, he says, IDF has no idea where the tunnels are. Yep, that's true. And your house was hit directly and there wasn't a tunnel attack. Yeah. Well, we know that most of the homes being hit, there's nothing in them. Fahed, in your opinion, what percentage of Gazan homes is there a tunnel, homes or buildings, are there tunnels leading into them?
ISIS didn't say, look, my strategy is to get my people killed and then hope that the international world community stops Israel short of victory. The aspect of the size of the enemy, right? Hopefully we'll talk about a couple of the previous battles that people used to do some type of comparison. Hamas was estimated to be 30 to 40,000 fighters on October 8th. That's just Hamas. As you have heard as well, there are other combatants that joined the fight in other terrorist organizations in Gaza. You have the Palestinian Islamic Jihad, you have Lions Den, you have like 14 other terrorist groups. And this is where a major contentious thing I have is people calling combatants and civilians. In my world and in the law of war, there's combatants and there's non-combatants. A non-combatant can turn themselves into a combatant and more easily than people think. You don't just have to shoot at the IDF or whoever to become a combatant. If you hold hostages, if you report on intelligence, if you carry ammunition, whole list of reasons. But just the size of the enemy in Gaza in a 20-year prepared defense is what it is very unique and was going to make the IDF challenge astronomically hard to even get to the enemy. The other aspect I would have liked to say until the end is that there's never been a war, and you've challenged people on this, where the civilian population is forced to stay inside of the main combat areas. The fact that Egypt on October 8th said not one person comes out of Gaza towards the Sinai Desert. Just from a military analysis, let alone a political analysis, I can't find that ever happening, right? In Ukraine, which I've been there, 3 to 5 million people left areas, massive civilian displacement in areas that Russia invaded, even still today. Syria, every war, the civilians get out of harm's way so that the militaries can have their fight and they'll be safeguarded or even move to humanitarian areas. Those, just the variables that before the war even actually starts, before the ground invasion starts, before the bombing starts, every aspect of the war against Hamas in Gaza is unique and there is no parallel. Hopefully we'll talk about the double standards, but I can keep going.
Yeah, so it's true there weren't evacuations, but you see how quick he is to blame this on Egypt. I mean, Israel is responsible for the evacuations. If they're gonna drop that amount of bombardments on Gaza, record levels, right? If you look at the amount of airstrikes done on such a small place, there's never been anything like that. It would be cool if Egypt and other countries took Gazans in, but the reason they don't want to is very obvious, because every time Palestinians get displaced, they're not allowed to return. So they see this as a permanent resettlement, essentially ethnic cleansing. Israel could have let them into the Negev and built a massive refugee camp. And Israel also could have done more of an effort to work with the international community to try to find a solution. It would have required promises that they'd be allowed to return, but there was minimal effort. And again, Israel controls the primary border with Gaza. 2/3 of Gazans are women, children, and elderly. There's a solution to the majority of the population. You could let them into your own territory and build a refugee camp. In fact, I hear a lot of Israelis even right-wing Israel is acknowledging that this would have been a better solution now, allowing Gazans in. We also often hear that, you know, they're ruled by Hamas. Hamas teaches them to hate. Okay, well, here's an opportunity to show them a different side of Israel, one that's not hateful. Now, it's also in 3 weeks after October 7th, the massive aerial bombardment started very on October 7th, and the first 3 weeks were by far the most deadly. Around 6,000 civilians were killed in the 3 weeks after October 7th. An interesting fact, that's more civilians than Palestinians have killed in the past. That's more civilians than Palestinians have killed Jews in the past 100 years. So it's not like Israel said, okay, we know we have a densely populated city. We need to work to do proper evacuations. And then we'll start bombardment. No, the aerial campaign, a brutal aerial campaign, started instantly and has lasted since. But the first 3 weeks, before there were any true attempt for real evacuations, you know, it already, the bombardment's already started. So, but notice how quick he is to blame Egypt, and nothing that he's not going to say what Israel could have done more. That's just not his MO, right? What could Israel have done to help evacuations? I'd be interested in hearing that from our urban warfare expert.
Because that's the other uniqueness. As I've studied, again, I'm currently studying other wars. There's no other war where Israel, if you put the word Israel in it, then there's a whole different standard in what can be done, the way they assess the war, the state, you know, the false claims of war crime, genocide, all these things contrary to what Israel does. This is all very unique. But war is a contest of will, so you have to get into, okay, fine, but how do you defeat Hamas? Even that standard, right? So the idea that Israel was supposed to have a day after plan in Gaza in October of 2023, like what? Okay, fine, but what's your plan? That would be like saying, okay, you know, you started against Japan and your goal is to defeat Japan, but what's your day after plan? No, you have to defeat the enemy. You have to take his power, and then you start to work on post-conflict operations. Every aspect. The number one thing that I've been fighting since.
All right, so let's talk about why there's this seemingly double standard. He says he has a lot of data points on other conflicts, but there's clearly things that are different here. First of all, there's a very strong global pro-Palestine movement that raises awareness about things happening in Palestine and to Palestinians. This is not a double standard. This is just an effective Palestinian rights movement that's been built over a decade. Many of the other instances of urban warfare are not with populations that have a global movement to back them and raise awareness when something's happening to them. So you are going to see a difference in how people talk about it because there's an existing movement that's been building now for decades. Second, talking about a day after plan. No, actually, I think a day after plan is very relevant, especially when it comes to Israel. We could know with a high degree of certainty on October 7th that, not high degree of certainty, with certainty that defeating Hamas has a relatively low chance of success, but the cost in trying is immense. This we know for sure. And we also know it's not that Israel has such a great track record of ensuring and protecting the rights of Palestinians when Hamas is not in power. You don't have Hamas in power in the West Bank. You have the PA. You had security cooperations for decades with the PA, and yet you have a brutal military occupation and continual expansion and an oppressive system. So, if Israel's plan, without a day after plan, as far as the world is concerned, Israel is now going to enact an immense toll on civilians, no guaranteeing success. And if they succeed, the best case scenario is a West Bank-like situation, which is also oppressive. So why should the world be okay with killing tens of thousands of civilians when you're most likely going to fail? And if you succeed, you still have a military occupation and an oppressive system. So yeah, we should be able to know what the day after plan is, because that's what's going to compel people to decide if this is legitimate or not. If you're gonna strip away tens of thousands, at this point potentially even 100,000, strip away that many people's inalienable right to life, you need to make a damn good case that you have no other option, and that in the end it's gonna be worth it, or at the very least that it has a high probability of being worth it. And if not, then don't expect the world to be on your side. And yeah, if there are other conflicts that people talk about less. Well, yeah, good job to the pro-Palestine movement for creating global awareness. It's not they shouldn't be accused of double standard. They should be accused of good activism for raising awareness about this. It's also there's other reasons why there's a lot of attention on Israel. We like to just say anti-Semitism. Sure, anti-Semitism plays into it, but there's many other very valid reasons. One is that it's a Western nation that's funded and supported by the West. You have a cringe level of support from U.S. politicians for Israel. Okay, so Israel gets special attention, special positive attention from the Western establishment. Okay, so people notice it more. And yeah, Western taxpayers care if their money is going towards human rights abuses. I think that's legitimate. Emperor Gador, thanks for the $5 super chat. Love your debunking, Adar. I look forward to watching the rest later. Thanks so much. Catch up later. All right, let's continue.
October 8th, though, has been this counting obsession. It's all a version of, which is a great book, Lies, Damn Lies, Statistics, where the goal is to make any number as big as a number, to make it as big as a problem. And for this war, it's been a global problem. And it's just repeating the number that comes from a terrorist organization. As somebody who studies war for a living, there's never been a single battle in history, not a war, but a battle, in which there is a running daily count of how many civilians are dying, down to the single digit, coming from the enemy within inside the battle, coming from Hamas. And the reason that is because it's impossible to know how many civilians are dying. And all these other battles, I can tell you about years later, that they still don't know how many civilians died. But the ideal inside of Gaza, and there's all kinds of these nefarious actors.
Well, yeah, I'm sure we're going to get into this, because this is one of the areas where John Spencer is the most dishonest. But when it comes to what we can know about death toll in Gaza, and yeah, the Ministry of Health is, out of any Ministry of Health that's ever dealt with daily fatalities, they're by far the most organized in releasing daily and monthly fatalities. No one's even come close to their level of organization and methodological process. It's something they deserve credit for. I know he's going to say there's all these flaws. We'll get into that. As you know, as those who view this channel know, this is probably my main area of research as of late. But that's not. So what's he complaining about? That the MOH, the Ministry of Health, is thorough and releases daily casualties? That's very much their right to do. I mean, Israel does the same. When people are dying, you hear about it daily. So I don't know why he says that's something negative. I mean, I know why he says it's negative. It's negative because it makes Israel look bad, but that's very much the right of the Ministry of Health to report daily on casualties. And I hope I need to turn actually, let me open a window. It's August in Israel. It's fucking hot, but the AC, whatever. I'll just need to deal with the heat. I open the window. The AC makes an annoying noise. Let's get back into it.
We're trying to invent ways to validate Hamas's casualty numbers. If not say, no, Hamas is not right, it's actually more. It's crazy that this statistical war, that this is how many civilians are dying and how many combatants are dying. There's never been a military in history, in any war, who's ever been asked, look, I know your war is just, your goals are just, but what's your civilian to combatant ratio? Because that's not the way the law works. That's not the way war works. And you would actually give people, every terrorist organization.
Oh, man. All the conversation on civilian to combatant ratio began from the pro-Israel side. There was no talk on civilian to combatant ratio until John Spencer and others started putting out these claims that it's 1-to-1. They created the conversation about it. And then there was legitimate pushback from people like myself and others who have done these analysis to show not only is it not 1-to-1, it's the highest in the 21st century by a significant margin. And now he's saying we're not meant to talk about civilian to combatant ratio. So this conversation started from John and his crew. That's wild. And I can tell you why people are talking about it, because they're trying to put pressure on Western governments to not support Israel. So if you focus on the cost to human life and the human rights violations and the humanitarian crisis, that is an effective means to put pressure on Western governments to not give Israel a blank check and a free pass to do what they wanted. So again, he's upset that people don't want this to happen. John, my guy, this is well within our right. We don't need to be okay with this level of death and destruction when there's when there's a low chance of success and there's no clear path to victory or day after plan. Yes, it is our right to object to this. And one of the ways to raise awareness is to talk about the very real toll this is taking. What are you salty about, my guy?
around the world, a recipe for success. Oh, just make the number as high as you can. It wasn't like this is the first time. Again, if you started studying war on October 7th, you could probably imagine like all kinds of stuff. This is the worst I've ever seen. Okay, have you studied any other war? Have you ever studied any other humanitarian aid operations? No, okay, then I can show you other times when it's worse and worse and worse. And the numbers, the chaos, even though the...
Show us a time where it's worse, John. I'm waiting. I would love for you to show us a higher civilian combatant ratio and a higher rate of children being killed and a higher percentage of the civilian population being killed. You need to go back to the Rwanda genocide to find a higher rate. I know this because I looked into it, but let's hear. Are you going to say what's worse, or are you just going to say that there are worse?
Context of Gaza is so unique that the world won't even acknowledge it, right? So the fact that going back to Egypt, and I just interviewed the Minister of Defense again to validate that in the last 21 months, not one delegation, not one nation, especially the UK, have ever brought up the topic of, what about Egypt? Couldn't we move the civilians out of harm's way? Couldn't we get them out of the Hamas hands and set up a humanitarian area in the Sinai? Not one delegation brought that up. So you have to ask the question, like, well, why is that? Why is it that Israel is held to not one double standard, but a whole list of double standards in war that no other nation in history has ever been held to, or would be if it happened to them?
John, there's a lot to unpack in what you're saying, but on the Egypt thing, I would imagine what the pro-Palestine people, so to speak, would say is what Israel really wants. I mean, Piers Morgan said this on our show. What Israel really wants is to displace the civilians from Gaza, is to get rid of the Palestinian Arabs who live there. Therefore, they would love nothing more than for those people to flee to other countries. And the reason that the neighboring countries don't want that to happen, A, they already have hundreds of thousands of Palestinians from previous eruptions of this conflict. We know that in many countries to which those groups of people have fled, that has caused a lot of instability. Egypt is a poor country with its own security problems. And so they don't want to play into Israel's hands and facilitate Israeli quote-unquote ethnic cleansing on the one hand. And on the other hand, they do not want to destabilize their own societies.
Yeah, I mean, good job, Constantine, giving that pushback, because that's actually very legitimate, and that's where it comes from. People, it's a form of extortion. It's saying, we're just going to keep killing civilians until you take them in, and if history tells us anything, they'll never be allowed to return.
Organ meats are some of the most nutrient-dense foods on the to stop packaged cattle organic pill. If you come to train people, set map ingredient or
the boycott
description of this episode.
Yep. So there's two things here. One, I can't help people that have BDS. So not the boycott, the best sanctioned awful thing that happens against Israel, but if you have BB derangement syndrome and you believe that he's just the nefarious actor that's guiding all this, or if you have TDS, Trump derangement syndrome, I would point, like you did recently, to somebody going, well, wait a minute, during World War II, there's massive population displacement in every war, actually, and you could talk 2020 war of Nagorno-Karabakh, 23 war of Nagorno-Karabakh, Ukraine, Syria, Yemen. Population displacement is historically exactly what happens to get civilians out of harm's way. Now, I'm not, people want to put me in a bucket of pro-Israel or put other people in the bucket of pro-Palestine. I think that's not the right framework. I'm pro-truth. And some people are anti-Israel. That becomes a fact. They actually don't care about.
No, John, you're definitely pro-Israel. You're not some neutral actor that's just trying to get to the bottom of what's going on. Like, let's be honest, Mike. Let's be honest. You're not just pro-truth. You're pro-Israel on this.
Palestinians or the cause. So if somebody's so adamant that Israel just wants to eradicate people, you don't listen to the words of actually Israeli leaders, like Minister Dermer, who's the Minister of Strategic Affairs, who has said, like, in the beginning, like, absolutely, pass a UN Security Council resolution saying that the people can come back after Hamas is defeated. But mainly, I would say, and I hope you can put it in a picture, take out a map, look at where Gaza is, and look at where the Sinai Desert is, and then look at where Egypt is. There's a massive area. So I think it's bullocks that's the excuse that people give. And
that's funny. Bullocks is a British word, but okay, cool. You have here Sinai, but look at the Negev. All this is desert. All of this massive area, something like 10 times the size of Gaza, is just desert in southern Israel. That's for the most part uninhabited. That's also an option.
Desert is, and then look at where Egypt is.
And the reason why, look, I understand the thought of letting in an enemy population while you're at war. I understand why Israel resists that. But the alternative is the mass killing of these civilians. So we could come up with a way to ensure safe passing of people in Gaza into the Negev. Again, 2/3 are women, children, and elderly. There's not a problem. You can do background checks on the men. It might take a little bit longer. There's a solution. You could have surveillance in this refugee camp. But bringing them into Israel, the reason why that's the best solution, it's because then it doesn't let Israel to just rid them of these population. They're still within Israel, Palestine, their native homeland, and it will force Israel to need to either return them to Gaza or absorb them into Israeli society. But the second you move them out, they're likely gone for good. The world is rightfully objecting to this.
A massive area. So I think it's bullocks that's the excuse that people give. And one, historically, it's never been the case. And they're actually prolonging the war. They're actually causing civilian death. all you would have to do on October 2023, right afterwards, Egypt launched a armor brigade and many other troops to the border to make sure no civilians got out. They built a new wall. There's actually 3 walls. They built a new wall to make sure that nobody got out. Now, if you're so adamant that you think that Israel, and there's this, in a lot of these positions, there's this nefarious Israeli theory underneath it, like, oh, they're trying to do things sneakily. They can't do it in the open, so they have these ulterior motives. Like, look, I look at it as a war objectively as possible. The fact that you say Israel, because you think they're nefarious, can't move the civilians out of the harm's way. You're not even if you're United Nations, and you want to create a humanitarian area where there won't be chaos, where Hamas won't cause the chaos. You could build a humanitarian area, and we're talking 2 million people. I fought in a neighborhood of Baghdad that's 2 million people. It isn't the scale that's the problem. It's the fact that this is Israel. So of course you can't create even if you want to create a fenced-in area in the Sinai Desert where every international agency, even international militaries or security forces could help provide security of that area. Well, no, it's not an option because we believe Israel has nefarious goals. But I'll go to the
Wait, did he say Sinai or Negev? Wait, did I miss something?
even if you want to create a fenced-in area in the Sinai Desert where every international
Sinai, okay.
agency, even international militaries or security forces could help. I go to the double standard. In war, if somebody starts a war and there's a response to that war, absolutely there is population displacement until the end of the war.
So it comes up with the plan, fence of our area, it'll be secure. Okay, Negev. Let's do it in the Negev. It's not an option because then he would need to acknowledge that Israel's in the wrong. Right? He says he cares about truth. Have we heard a critique yet? I'm not sure I've ever heard him critique Israel. Let's see if there's one here, but I'm not sure he's ever critiqued Israel. So people do definitely have Trump derangement syndrome and Netanyahu derangement syndrome, but he's just a bootlicker, right? Anything Netanyahu does, he'll support. And I guess this is the split between him and Andrew Fox at this point, but I hope we get to that.
And then if somebody's saying, well, the border shouldn't change either, right? So everything should be the exact same as October 6th before Hamas, the government of Gaza and its military invaded Israel. People don't understand the second and third order effects of trying to create this standard because it's Israel, because you believe you know the Israel-Palestine history, which most people don't, or they're what we call revisionist history, where they try to invent the history of things that happened. It's because it's Israel. So I say that argument, right? I don't attack people. I attack the veracity of their statements. And that just, as one of the presidents said, that dog don't hunt. Like, your facts are not right that Israel can't do this. And that the Trump plan, to call the Trump plan ethnic cleansing is insanity. It is straight TDS. That the movement of people, to allow people to voluntarily leave somewhere where there is suffering, combat, awful things happening, but no, because it's Palestinians, you've got to stay in there. That's insanity, and it needs to stop, because if not...
No, that's the definition of ethnic cleansing. I'm sorry. To make Gaza unlivable by systematically destroying vital civilian infrastructure, from the healthcare system to homes to cropland to their water system to all institutions, to stopping aid from coming in, obviously people would voluntarily leave. And then to not let them return, that's ethnic cleansing. There's no other way to look at that. The only way it's not ethnic cleansing if there's a guarantee that they could return. That's not part of the Trump plan. So yeah, so we see that John Spencer's explicitly supporting ethnic cleansing of Gazans. He's just calling it by a different name.
And what I write about a lot as well is, like, if you say this about Israel, are you just saying, well, this won't apply to us, UK, France, whatever. This won't happen to us, so we won't have to follow these rules. We just want Israel to follow these rules. Let me give you something that nobody I've ever seen on your show do, is what would happen if this happened to the United States? I can talk Britain as well. What would the United States do if an October 7th style attacks? I don't even have to do the comparative numbers, right? The fact that it's like 40,000 civilians dead and thousands taken hostages. The United States military would respond immediately with overwhelming force. And I have to give people a class on what is proportionality in war. Like, what is disproportionate? The United States would have responded to October 7th with amazing military force, because we have 10 active divisions. We have the ability to dominate the sky. We would have made sure not a single rocket came out of enemy areas headed to our cities, like Los Angeles, if you talk about the southern border. There were 4,000 rockets launched by Hamas on the morning of October 7th, and then there were about 8,000 more launched since then. The U.S. military would have immediately invaded that territory to retrieve our hostages. It would have encouraged other countries and used all of our forms of national power to encourage them to allow people to get out of harm's way, and we would have tried to end it as quickly as possible. And I think that's where people...
I mean, the United States is one of the countries that's committed the most war crimes in the 21st century, so that shouldn't be our standard for measuring if you're going to deal with something properly or not. I'm not convinced the U.S. would have dealt with it the same way. We saw an abundance of war crimes in Iraq and some in Afghanistan, but there was a much lower level of proportionality in those conflicts than we're seeing in Gaza. For example, Bin Laden, right, the most wanted man in the world. When they found out where he was, they didn't just blow up the home. They sent in the Navy SEALs to risk their lives just to make sure they could assassinate him. Think about that. That's the most wanted man. And we saw another example when there was, under Obama, he had the controversial drone program. there was a report that came out that the civilian combatant ratio of the drone program is around 1-to-1. That was very controversial. People were outraged. In Gaza, they're operating at much different levels than we've seen. Not Assad, not Putin, not in Iraq, completely different levels of proportionality. Whistleblowers shared that it was permissible to kill up to 20 civilians for a low-level combatant and triple-digit civilians for a high-level combatant. Tell me where we've seen these levels of proportionality. The U.S. was not doing this. They weren't. As many war crimes as they committed, they were not doing this. So A, I don't think the U.S. should be the standard. B, based on past conflicts, they did not engage with this level of force and with this level of callous disregard for civilian life. They didn't. But our urban warfare's experts should know this, but he's not being honest about that.
Misunderstand. We would also have done the same things Israel is doing to try to protect civilians. And I have boldly said, and I challenge anybody, prove me wrong, that Israel has done more to protect civilians, as in the measures that any military has ever created in history. And because people don't know these, they haven't studied these, they're called civilian harm mitigation measures. Israel has done more than any nation in history, to include any Western nation. What they have done to protect civilians, we would have done some of those, but we would have immediately responded with overwhelming. That's the goal in war, is to use overwhelming military force to convince your enemy to do your...
He said, prove me wrong, but tell us what they did that you say is more. Right. So part of doing more, it's not enough to say if they've done more. So let's give an example. I don't think he explains what this more is, but let's say Israel does more. We often hear roof tapping. Israel gets credit for the roof tapping policy, right? We hear, oh, what other countries roof tap? The reason why Israel does more roof tapping is because Israel does, you don't roof tap a building that has combatants in it, because then the combatants leave, right? You roof tap buildings that's civilian infrastructure. Israel has a much more consistent history, pre-October 7th and certainly post-October 7th, of systematic destruction of civilian infrastructure. So they roof tap more because they destroy more civilian infrastructure, right? So if you only look at one side, then it gives this impression that they're doing more. But the reason they're doing more is because of their already increased level of aggression. So it's just a dishonest framing. So imagine, here's just another numerical way to look at it. Let's say Israel does 20% more than any other country in terms of precaution, but they use 100% more force. That 20% more is canceled out very quickly. If you're doing 100% more force, 20% more precaution is not enough. So this is just another dishonest framing that he's making. And it's why we're seeing record rates of children being killed and civilians being killed for the 21st century.
Will, as in to either give back the hostages, surrender, or you take what it values most, which is its population centers in its land. That's war. That's why the framework of this is all wrong.
John, I'm really glad that we're having this conversation, because the old adage says the first casualty of war is the truth. And one of the difficulties that has been for me when I've been following this, because we've been conducting these interviews, and I'm sure everybody, is working out what is true and what isn't. So let's talk about the casualties. How do we know that these casualties the stats are accurate, or as accurate as they possibly can be?
All right, this part's going to be good.
They say women and children killed. What do they mean by children? Does that mean up to the age of 18, 21? Women, could these women be combatants as well? Explain a little bit more for us.
Sure. Well, one, I've already explained that nobody in the history of war has ever been asked, but what's your civilian to combatant ratio? Nobody's ever taken the enemy's word on the casualty count. But fine, even if you took the enemy's casualty count, so Hamas, the Gaza Health Ministry, one, if you believe that there's a number or a story or a photo that leaves Gaza without the permission of Hamas, then you're biased. Mm-hmm. So of the casualty counts, and I know I heard Piers Morgan say there's been 20,000 kids killed in Gaza, which is a lie. I really find it.
We have the names of names and ID numbers of 18,000 children already. And this does not include indirect deaths, and it doesn't include those not yet accounted for. So 20,000, maybe it's 19,000, but it's not a large exaggeration. Hold on, I'm opening the list right now. 0 to 17, 17,921 confirmed. I'm sure maybe there's a margin of error of a few percent here, but this is an undercount because not everybody's accounted for. But we'll soon get into how we can verify this, because I'm sure he's not going to, he always skips over this. He says there's no way to know, they're just made up. We'll get into that.
Weird that people that are just anti-Israel will say numbers that even Hamas doesn't say. You're absolutely right if we talk about children, right? Because that's where they go to. Like, John, I don't care that you say Israel has done more. They're not effective. I'm like, that's not true either. The Hamas Gaza Health Ministry numbers have been shown to be methodologically and statistically, even data-centrically wrong, full of errors.
No.
Full of double names. Have you ever asked any of these people that use these numbers, have you seen the Gaza Health Ministry list of people who have died by natural causes?
Okay, cool. Absolutely false. Sure, you find some margin of error. You currently have 60,000 lines of data. There's been some errors, especially at the beginning. The Ministry of Health produces, at the beginning, every few months, a list of fatalities, all their names and ID numbers. At the very beginning, they were doing so when their systems were down, doing so with the collapse of their healthcare system. By no means a perfect list. There was a margin of error. Every time they release a list, we see them make corrections, updating the list. Now, something John will never mention, and people who try to cast doubt on the death toll never mention, is that they release names and ID numbers. All these names and ID numbers exist in the Palestinian Population Registry, which Israel has full access to. Israel can verify the legitimacy of this list. Israel themselves do not deny, publicly they do not deny the legitimacy of this list. And we know from IDF intelligence whistleblowers that they actually verified and rely on this data. So this is not just Hamas claims. No, we shouldn't trust anything Hamas says, same way we shouldn't trust anything Israel says. But this is verifiable data that Israel can cross-reference. And they do. And they rely on it. So to just ignore this, it's either you have no idea what you're talking about, which the majority don't. The majority generally don't know this, or you're being dishonest. So when you look at this, I just opened the list. It's also, not only can Israel verify it, this is a publicly available list. It's been under immense public scrutiny, and no one has found any fraud. The only thing people have identified is a reasonable margin of error. They present that margin of error as fraud. This is what Andrew Fox and Eisenberg are big on. But one thing they never answer, almost all the margin of error they discover because the Ministry of Health improves the list from release to release. Why would the Ministry of Health, if they could just fabricate names and ID numbers, why would they make any mistakes? Why would they update it? Why would they make any modifications? Why would they remove names? None of this is behavior if it's fraudulent. If it's fraudulent, you could just make this shit up and you never need to modify it. They're going through great lengths to make it as accurate as possible. And then these propagandists take this effort to make it more accurate as sign of fraud. It's ridiculous and it's very dishonest. I've put out many debunkings of this, but I'm also going to do another debunking either next week or the week after, both on Twitter in a written version and a video, just the death toll, where it's at, and an estimate on civilian combat ratio. But we very much have verifiable data. There hasn't been fraud found. It's a complete lie that there's been all these problems found that make it illegitimate. There's no basis to that whatsoever. And I had one more point on that, but whatever. I think we covered this enough. If I remember, I will say it later. For those who don't know, it's almost midnight here, so I'm slowing down.
No, it doesn't exist. So 20,000 kids, supposedly. You're right. The United Nations puts kids at 18. So that's a list of people, anybody below the age of 18. I joined the military at 17. I would have been on that list. The fact that Hamas has radicalized the entire population, employs child soldiers, they don't care. Nobody cares. But what about the babies, John? I'm like, okay, I absolutely agree. And this is the insanity of, you want perfection in war, you want a bloodless war. The laws of war account for civilian death and say you have to take everything reasonable and feasible to prevent it. And Israel has done that. But back to the numbers. There is no way, and this is, again, you have people, insane people, and I'm sorry that they're in the UK, who say they've figured out a way to figure out how many casualties have died. So they won't even take Hamas's numbers, right? Which, again, every statistic that has spread around the world has been shown to be false. That's not what Hamas says. You know, the majority women, majority children. False, false. The fact that they can try to say, well, this many innocent...
No, hold on. Majority women and children was actually a Gaza media office claim. So there's two sources of reporting data out of Gaza. One is the Ministry of Health, which releases verifiable data. Their daily numbers is not verifiable. You could be skeptical of their daily reporting, but their fatality list is the gold standard. It can be relied on. It's not 100% accurate, but it's an undercount, not an overcount. Again, indirect deaths aren't there, and we know that it's impossible to account for everybody in real time. And the way we know indirect deaths aren't there, or at the very least, most indirect deaths aren't there, is because indirect deaths, as well as natural deaths, are primarily very young, so 0 and 1 year olds, and elderly. So if they were adding indirect natural deaths, which Spencer claimed they're likely adding, you would see an unusual spike amongst 0-year-olds and an unusual spike in the 80+ range or 70+ range. You don't see these spikes in the data. So we have very strong reason to believe, or to know, that the majority of indirect and natural deaths are not being added. Is it plausible that some amount of indirect and natural deaths have been added? Yes, but not the majority, because if it was the majority, we would see these unusual spikes. Again, data paints a clear picture. John's not going to be honest and tell this to us. Now, he talks about child soldiers. The list does not have room for many child soldiers. If you look, and I'll open it right now. If we look at, let's take ages 17 to 13, and there's been really no evidence of 13, 14, 15-year-olds in any meaningful way. There's a Twitter account, Middle East Buka. He does a lot of research and tries to identify different combatants. He's found 3 that are under 18. One of them was 13, but he was a messenger. But you only use child soldiers if you have a lack of 18+-year-olds. They're just more fit. They're stronger. There's no shortage of young men in Gaza willing to fight. And if you're saying there's a significant usage of child soldiers, show us videos, show us photos. There's a lot of surveillance in Gaza. Show us children engaging in hostilities. But the best way to know that, at the very least, on the data we have, there's not a lot of children, is just by looking at the difference between boys and girls. So between 13 and 17, you have 3,796 boys killed. And when you look at the amount of girls killed, you have 1914. Okay. So the excess, now we want to see the excess, because that could give us a range. You have 1,882 more boys killed than girls in ages between 13 to 17. So you could assume, okay, fine. So there's 1,800 child soldiers on that list. But no, because boys of all ages are dying at a higher rate. Boys as young as 0 are dying at a higher rate. And men as old as 60 are dying at a higher rate, because in all conflict, unless there are rare instances where women are specifically targeted, males die at a higher rate. They take more risks, like getting food, water, and aid. They work in more dangerous jobs like first responders, and they're confused of being combatants. So we see in excess males of all ages. So it's not 1,800. It's not even 1,800 child soldiers. It's going to be significantly less. And significantly less, maybe a few hundred if we want to be very charitable. And the reason we're seeing like 0, 1, 2, and up to like 15, 18, whatever year olds dying at a higher rate, it's not only for the reasons I said. There's actually more boys born than girls. There's 5% more boys born than girls. By the time they become elderly, it evens out, because men die younger and they die, at work at a higher rate. But the reason you're going to see an excess even between the ages 0 to 6 is just because there's more boys born than girls. So the data very clearly shows that there's no significant usage of child soldiers. You can make the claim that there's a significant usage, but they're just not being added to the list. But based on available data, this list does not include child combatants in any meaningful way. So yes, we have 18,000 confirmed child deaths, not including indirect deaths, and not including those who have not yet been accounted for. So saying 20,000 children, innocent children, have been killed is not a stretch. It's not hyperbolic. It's not propaganda. It's a very legitimate claim.
Civilians. And this is where I really, as an analyst of multiple wars, is that we believe, not me, but other people, that there is somebody in Gaza who can point to a body, even if it's an adult male, and say, well, that person was a combatant, and that person was not a combatant. They weren't partaking in the hostilities. Is there civilian death in Gaza? Absolutely. It's a war. And Hamas kills people themselves. I mean, over 20% of Hamas's rockets, so over 13,000 rockets they've launched at Israel, have landed inside of Gaza, killing Gazans. They go on the list. Really, anybody who's died for any reason goes on the list. If you were a Hamas terrorist who crossed the border into Israel to kill, slaughter, rape, and maim, and died, you're on the list. The list is insane, but and other people have picked it apart from a data perspective. I think it's insane that there's a fascination on the list when the actual question for any military other than Israel is that military following the laws of war in distinction, necessity, proportionality, and overwhelming? It is yes. There's actually not been a single case to be shown that Israel has targeted civilians. Has been collateral damage? Yes. But here's some numbers in case people are so fascinated with the numbers, which I think is...
So just a few more things. He said everybody's being added to the list. We already said we know indirect deaths and natural deaths are not being added to the list. We also, through open source research, could know this, right? I had a viewer help me. He found 15 people killed by Hamas, and I think 10 children died from hypothermia, malnutrition. None of them were on the list. So we actually know that they're not just adding everybody to the list. There's no unusual spikes in data suggesting that they're being added to the list. And it's also plausible that combatants aren't being added to the list at the same rate for two reasons. A, they're unaccounted for at a higher rate because they might be buried under tunnels. And also it's possible Hamas is explicitly asking the Ministry of Health to not include combatants, as to not give Israel intel as to how many of their own have been killed. So the list can't give us on its own the civilian combatant ratio, but it gives us a minimum baseline of how many civilians have been killed. And when you look at the excess males to females on the list, there's very few, if any, combatants on this list. And this will be, I'll put this on this will be part of the analysis. I'll make a chart. You'll see how you can know that there's very few combatants on the available list. So no, he's completely wrong. They're not just throwing people on the list. There's no reason to believe that. The data suggests otherwise. Open source research also suggests otherwise. Now, he did say there's these people in London that aren't relying on Ministry of Health. He's talking about Mike Spagat in his study. That was actually a very interesting and I think clever methodology. They said, yeah, let's try to understand what the civilian death toll is without relying on the Ministry of Health. They surveyed, I think, 800 homes, meaning they spoke to 800 homes. They told them there's no monetary compensation for responding. So they wanted to make it clear that there's no bias, so there wouldn't be a bias, a reason to lie. And they said, how many people were living in your household on October 6th? How many people are living in your household today? So they didn't say anything about deaths. They just said living then, living now. And they said, okay, what happened to those who are no longer living there? And they collected that data. In doing so, and then you do 800, you get an average overall of Gaza. In doing so, they understood that there's an undercount. The Ministry of Health is undercounting by around 40%. So that was the analysis they put out. And they were also able to identify something like 8,000 indirect deaths just by looking at how many excess deaths there'll be over natural deaths. It's a very, very, very good study. And he's just saying people are saying that, he said people in London are not relying on their data. They're saying it's higher. Yeah. Well, if you look at the methodology of the Ministry of Health, the Ministry of Health is doing confirmed deaths, confirmed violent deaths, and not including indirect deaths. So Spagat and his crew found a way to analyze it without needing to rely on confirmed deaths, but surveying homes and including indirect deaths. And they saw there's an undercount. Those who have been reviewing this honestly from the beginning know there's an undercount. I put out a review, I believe over a year ago now, saying that the civilian death toll is anywhere from 20% to 100% higher than what the Ministry of Health is saying because of indirect deaths and those unaccounted for. This has been confirmed by Spagat's study. It was confirmed by another study put out by Lancet, not the controversial Lancet study that spoke about indirect deaths, but another one that used social media obituaries to do some cross-referencing. Interestingly, they also found a 40% undercount from the Ministry of Health, the same exact undercount that Spagat found using a different methodology. So all honest review will tell you that what the Ministry of Health is saying is an undercount. Also, Matthew Concrell on Twitter is History Speaks. If you all remember, a few months ago, there was they're saying, oh, Hamas quietly removed all these names from the list. Okay, first of all, if they're trying to inflate the numbers, why are they removing names? Keep names in, add names. Why remove them, right? So first of all, reaching the conclusion that a removal of names is a sign of them trying to inflate the list makes no sense. But the propagandists don't care about making sense. They just care about selling a narrative. Well, Matthew, what he did with a team of researchers in Gaza, they looked at the names that were removed and discovered that a significant number of them were actually violently killed in airstrike. He discovered this through online obituaries. The Ministry of Health removed those who were actually killed because the way their death was reported was through the family reporting system. The family reported them, and they didn't fill out the paperwork properly. So the Ministry of Health is being very careful in removing actually real dead people who were killed in airstrikes. So we know it's an undercount. And you could say that the Ministry of Health is just really, it's a group of doctors doing their best to release data. And I think there's a good chance that's the case. But you could also make the case that the reason they're trying very hard to be accurate is because if they're not accurate, Israel has a way to know that, and Israel has every incentive to discredit them, right? So not only whether it's a valiant effort or they're just doing it so they not get caught in a lie, they're going through great lengths for the list to be as accurate as possible. Any honest actor who's researched this should know this stuff. So either John has not researched this and he's just speaking confidently on something he doesn't know about, or he's intentionally omitting essential information to paint a narrative. It's dishonest or irresponsible. Both are inexcusable.
Really problematic because, again, when you have a combatant, a non-state actor like Hamas, who purposely doesn't wear a uniform, doesn't distinguish itself, just that. I mean, in Ukraine, millions of civilians joined the fight against the Russian invasion, and they wrapped the yellow or blue tape around their arm. I don't know where they got all this tape, but they immediately distinguished themselves, even if they're carrying ammunition or whatever, as partaking in the hostilities. But let's talk about numbers, right? So I was getting the number early in the war, like 10,000 people killed. I'm like, okay, it's a war that nobody's seen in modern history. All those variables, the size of the combatant, the dense urban areas. But there's only one battle in American history, I can't find one in British history, that has any of the parallels, as in the density of the urban terrain, the presence of civilians, a vicious enemy, and that's the 1945 Battle of Manila. I don't know if you know it. In 1945, after the U.S. military was defeated in the Philippines, we returned, and there were roughly 3,000 to 4,000 POWs and internees, so hostages, men, women, and children being held in the city of Manila, a city of about 1.1 million. There were 17,000 Japanese defenders. The U.S. military attacked to retrieve our hostages and liberate the city with about 35,000. So even the scale is not correct. In that battle, we retrieved our hostages, but again, 35,000 American and other attacking the city of 17,000 Japanese defenders. There were 100,000 civilians that died in that battle. And nobody made a New York Times op-ed that was on the cover that's saying too many civilians died in this war. Why was that? Well, because it's war, because the Japanese were the ones who were slaughtering the civilians in that war. Or let me give you one.
I mean, why are you talking about something 100 years ago? We've made so much moral progress. We passed international law, Geneva Convention. He's describing a time when you still had segregation in the United States, where marital rape was legal, where slavery was still acceptable in many parts of the world. Don't have that be the moral standard for how you're talking about conflict in the 21st century. We should strive to continuously make moral progress. 1945 is just completely irrelevant. Fahed, so you said Fahed or Gazan friend saying hundreds were buried in the streets and close to where they were killed because there's no access to the hospital. One of them is a friend of mine. He was buried next to his home. Right. So we're hearing this from many Gazans. Fahed, can you send me his full name? I want to check if he's actually in the MOH list. His full name would be helpful. And I'll wait. Hold on. Did they? Yep, his full name all in one, and I'll check it right now. If you're cool with that.
Another one. Again, this fascination with the numbers is crazy.
But John, can I just interrupt you there? I know you saying this fascination with numbers is crazy. I do understand. And from an academic perspective, I agree with you. But let's also be honest. You know, this is a war that has not just been fought on the battlefield. It's not just been fought diplomatically. It's also been fought in the modern day arena of social media. And there are millions of people all over the world, particularly in the West, who are having horrific images shown on their phones of horrendous suffering of civilians. So I know what you're saying, but also as well, I do understand the fascination, because if you've just seen a baby blown up, then that's going to be at the forefront of your mind, surely. Absolutely. And again, if you started studying war on October 7th, you would realize that is a uniqueness as well, right? The fact that a war of this scale and of this viciousness is aired on the phones, the algorithm actually drives it to their phones. Every awful thing that's happened in war gets driven to the uninformed minds of massive populations. That is unique. And this is where, if we would have had TikTok during even the Korean War, right? In the Korean War, over 2 million civilians died in the Korean War. It's a 37-month war. That's 50,000 civilians dying a month for every month of the war for 37 months. Had we had TikTok during that.
The civilian combatant ratio in Korea wasn't nearly as bad as in Gaza, by the way.
Of course, there would be something different. Had this not been Israel, there would be something different, because they start with the image and that's awful. Israel did this on purpose, and they don't want to listen to anybody with any contradictory information about why is this happening. And the ideal that, well, of course, it's awful. Look what's happening, and there are innocent civilians who are dying.
Yeah, I mean, the age of social media gives us a greater awareness of how horrible war is, and creates greater public outrage. That's excellent. That's good. We should support that. The mass killing of civilians is not something we should accept as normal or okay. So if the fact that we have phones allow us to have greater awareness for how atrocious this is, we should encourage and celebrate that, not be salty about it. He's constantly upset at the progress, at the moral progress we're making as a species. He wants us to stay in the past, to be barbaric, to be murderous.
But that's not the intention, which we could get to this baseless claim of genocidal intent. That is not the intention of the IDF in any way, shape, or form. It is actually the intention of Hamas. Do you realize that every individual in Gaza could fit in Hamas's tunnels with ease? There's over 400 miles of tunnels. All 2.2 million civilians could fit in those tunnels, but you've never seen an image of a single civilian in those. And I do war around the world. In Ukraine, the civilians sought refuge because Russia didn't give notice in the tunnels, and they still do in the subways and all that to escape the awful attacks of Russia. So yes, you're right. Absolutely, there's a fascination again with Israel because I haven't seen protests about the awful things, and I don't do whataboutisms, but it's just actual veracity of comment. Where are you on the atrocities that are happening in Yemen, in Sudan, and all these other areas, even in humanitarian aid distribution? During the Somalia.
All right, this is also a dumb argument. The fact that people still bring this up. Generally, when you protest, you're protesting your government to do something different or to stop doing something it's doing. The reason, or a primary reason, major amounts of energy are going into protests in the West because the West is supporting Israel. They're not protesting Israel. They're protesting their government's support for Israel. If the US was supporting atrocities elsewhere in the world, then you'd be much more likely to see people protesting that. This argument doesn't make any sense. What do you think? People are going to march in New York and say, unless your ask is for intervention, right? If you really, if you want something to be done about what's happening in Sudan, you could protest and want your government to intervene. But the protests here are not so much about intervention. It's about stopping the support. It's much harder to stop what's happening in Sudan because it would require boots on the ground. In Israel, it would simply require the U.S. creating an ultimatum. So it's something very clear-cut and obvious that you're going to protest, right? It's similar here. You know, yesterday we had record levels of protests. Some people are putting the numbers. The government put the numbers at 2.5 million people. It's like a fourth of the population were in protests yesterday. And then some people are saying you should be protesting Hamas. No. What does that mean, protest Hamas? Do they owe us anything? Can we put any pressure on them? Are they going to listen to us? We have no way to impact Hamas's decisions through protest. We can impact our government's decisions. So this whole thing about like, why are they not protesting other conflicts? It's just, it's not an intelligent argument. I'm sorry.
War, 200 to 300,000 people had died of starvation, and then the United Nations and others tried to get aid to the population and failed because the clans took it. They killed humanitarian aid workers. I'm fine if people are anti-war. I'm not fine if people are anti-fact on what is happening in Gaza.
Let me introduce you to the people who are investing. VAT, explain everything, and it's safe. I reckon that's pure
situation. Aid and
Is that 3 months? No, that's 2 months.
So, you know, he said he's okay if people are anti-war. He's not okay if people are anti-fact. But and there are anti-fact, right? Some people are saying the death toll in Gaza is a few 100,000. That is anti-fact. But the movement is not built on misinformation. It might be fueled by some misinformation, but we have daily videos of dismembered and dead children. People are seeing what's happening. People are against this. That's not being anti-fact. They're being anti-war. John is pro-war.
What happens? An 11-week pause. But again, even the people you've had on who so-called are informed about it don't give you the full picture. So during the last ceasefire, which was right before this pause of the humanitarian going in, it was 42 days of cease. There were 25,000 trucks of aid that went in during those 42 days. And then there was a pause in more aid going in while Israel and the United States enacted the Gaza Humanitarian Foundation in southern Gaza, mostly 3 sites in southern Gaza, 1 in northern Gaza. Nobody talks about, well, where did that 25,000 trucks of aid go and how long would that last? While Israel developed a plan to continue the war, but also move civilians into southern Gaza and increase the aid there, they never said they wanted to stop UN aid. They said they wanted to phase it out because of the fact not only was Hamas gathering, and I saw some, recently of course, there was a humanitarian crisis happening, but of all the people to be blamed, it was only Israel being blamed, right? And this is the 1,000 trucks of the United Nations, because people won't give you the timeline. And I love long form podcasts because let's talk about it. Let's talk about the ceasefire, right? So not only did 25,000 trucks of aid go in, Hamas insisted and would not give hostages back unless Israel allowed 1 million Palestinians to move back into northern Gaza on top of rubble, minefields, everything, so that it would be really hard for Israel to continue the war and provide humanitarian aid, which was centered on the south of Gaza. For some reason, that escapes people, that the fact that there was this massive population displacement back into northern Gaza for Hamas's strategy. And what Israel was trying to do was concentrate the aid distribution into southern Gaza. People don't also recognize that there's been a statistic of how much does flour cost, right? So there's some really good analysis about the price of flour going up in northern Gaza. Okay, who's selling the flour? That's actually not just Hamas, but there's not a production of any aid going in Gaza. It's a war zone. So that's aid that's been delivered that Hamas and Gaza civilians take and then sell back to civilians. It's a war zone. The idea that you're making Gazans walk through combat areas to get to the aid in southern Gaza. The entire Gaza Strip is a war zone. What are you people talking about? Israel tried to create a mechanism to get the aid directly to the people, and it was successful. But then let's talk about how Hamas tried to make it unsuccessful. Before, the Gaza Humanitarian Foundation gave out one box of food.
No. I'm sorry, John. You're not going to get away with yet another lie. If Israel's goal was to get aid to the people, there's no explanation for why they would stop all aid from entering for 2.5 months. And then when they started the GHF, they were letting in delivering an average of 0.63 meals per person per day. That's not an effort to feed the people. It's not. If your concern is that Hamas is stealing aid and monetizing it, which is not something that has really been proven with evidence, we do know it's getting looted by armed militias, but there's many armed militias. And one of the reasons we could assume with a pretty high degree of certainty that a lot, if not most of these militias are not Hamas is because they're not getting blown up by Israel. We know that Israel will kill a militant in their home with an entire family there. They'll have no problem blowing up a truck if there's militants there. Now, but let's just say they are stealing aid for their storages. Maybe they want to sell it. The solution is to flood Gaza with so much aid that it's not monetizable and that there's no incentive to loot it. You're looting aid because it's scarce, and it's monetizable because it's scarce. So the solution is flooding Gaza with aid, not restricting aid. Israel restricting aid the way they did increases the incentive to loot it and allows it to be more monetizable. And no, you can't, there's no mechanism that you could build that's going to feed 2 million people while keeping that aid out of the hands of 30,000 combatants. It's impossible. So the whole narrative doesn't make any sense, and there's a very clear solution for how to solve it. So UV, I see you're saying they loot aid to sell it. No, the people selling aids are merchants. Show me some documentation. Even Israel said they don't have evidence of Hamas doing this. The UN said this, and Israel said this. So you're just buying into whatever the online Hasbara that makes claims, baseless claims. Show me a Hamas militant sitting there selling aid, a video, a report, anything. But again, even if that's true, there's a very simple solution. What Israel did was increase the incentive for looting and for monetization. They didn't decrease it. And in doing so, they also created a greater humanitarian crisis where people are starting to die from starvation.
Hamas put out written guidance and oral, like they put it on their X feeds, they put it out everywhere. If you take a single meal from this initiative, you will face severe consequences. And then they went out and attacked the humanitarian zone. And yes, it was chaos. Is it the most chaos that's ever been seen in war? No.
I'm not sure they attacked it. That's there's actually maybe one report of a grenade thrown or something, but all of these were in areas where under Israel control. It's not like Hamas has a strong presence in areas that are under Israel control. It's not that they were attacked daily. The daily shootings at the aid sites were by Israel. Israel admitted to shooting. We have video evidence of them shooting. We have endless testimonials from people on the ground on shooting, from different NGOs on the ground that Israel's shooting. We know that Israel's using live fire in these aid sites. And I didn't look deeply into it, but there was one report of, I think, a grenade thrown that they claimed was Hamas. But again, that very well could be bullshit as well. I admittedly haven't looked into it. But he's making it seem like this was just this constant thing. Every day Hamas was showing up at the aid sites and shooting people. There's no basis for that. That's also bullshit.
No, that's absolutely ridiculous. It was chaos because Hamas was causing it, and the IDF adjusted their operations in securing the outer zones. And no, I'm not a fan of warning shots. What I'm not a fan of more, though, is people that selectively take the facts and paint the story with that nefarious, bad Israeli intention here, is that they were trying to starve the population. Absolutely not, right? This is the idea of how much aid, not just food, medical supplies, field hospitals, new water pipes that Israel has done to try to get to the people. And we have to talk about even the people being a part of this. In war, if you get the notice to evacuate, then those civilians should evacuate. But because of Hamas and other reasons, you see civilians not evacuating areas that when evacuation notices, because they have been told to evacuate, and then Hamas pushed them back, and now they're being asked to be moved again. The insanity here is the nefarious Israel was trying to starve the population as a mechanism of warfare, and that's not true. Just if you just lay out all the facts, what happened from the last ceasefire until today, which Israel has flooded. Now you have flooding of aid going in, not just from the Gaza Humanitarian Foundation. The UN decided to start picking up the trucks again because of why they said they were stopping. You have airdrops, you have many mechanisms. I don't see that being the cover of anybody's news, though. Israel floods Gaza with aid. Well, I haven't seen that.
John, even if people...
Israel floods Gaza with aid after massive international public outcry and after children started dying daily of malnutrition. This was after 2.5 months of Israel letting no aid in, and after another 2 months of them letting in 0.6 meals per person per day. I mean, it's very clear that this is just propaganda, right? There's zero attempt to be objective and honest here. Zero. I still haven't heard one thing he criticized Israel for, right?
We'll accept all of that, which of course many people dispute, but let's say it's all true. Even many people who are supportive of Israel's campaign to destroy Hamas, including Andrew Fox, who we had on the show recently, as you know, feel that not much is being achieved anymore. Like, what is the goal now? Like, I know there's 25 hostages left, but...
Wait, hold on. I lost my stream. I'm excited for this part to see his split with Andrew Fox, because it's easy to put them into the same camp. But I think Andrew Fox is not pro-Netanyahu. He's just pro-military. So whatever the military says, he sees as he tends to think the military just knows what to do and they're doing the right thing. And now the head of the military doesn't want to continue, so he's tending to go with them. I'm speculating as to his rationale. John Spencer's a little bit more of a Netanyahu shill, it seems. Whatever Netanyahu goes, it seems like he'll be behind. But this is speculating on their worldview and their mental model of the world. It's going to be interesting to see where they disagree. But I think this is what it is.
Really worth, and also of course the damage to Israel's reputation, because you can talk about the realities on the ground. The fact is that if there's one war that Israel is definitely not winning, it's the PR war, right? That's just a fact. And by the way, I have to say, we've tried to have the Prime Minister of Israel on our show many times. We've invited him on because I believe it's very important for the world to hear from them as well. And you don't seem to get anywhere, and they don't seem to do many interviews with even fair-minded people like us. So it just feels like their side is not really putting out their message in the way that you might be. But my question to you is, which is what I'd like to ask them really, is what is now being achieved by continuing this war? What is the rationale here?
I don't attack people, I attack veracity of statements. Has Israel been successful at achieving its goals in the last 21 months? One, we have a fascination with short wars. The idea that if you accept, which again, if people, everybody can have their own opinions about the war, but they can't have their own facts. Okay. They can't have their own facts about what Israel has done and what Hamas has done.
Okay, well, let's talk about the fact. What are Israel's war goals? And then we can assess whether they've achieved them, and also whether continuing the war helps to achieve more of them.
Right, so if you study war, then this is why I wanted to interview the Prime Minister, the Minister of Defense, and the head of the IDF. Just that chain is how, somebody recently said on your show that this is just for political reasons. I'm like, okay, war by definition is the pursuit of political goals. Israel's 3 goals have not changed since October 8th. And if you listen to the Prime Minister, Minister Dermer, everybody in Israel's political military apparatus, the goals have not changed. Number 1, return the hostages. Israel has returned, through the use of many forms of national power, both military and political, over 200 of the 250 hostages in less than 21 months, against an irrational actor who will only give up hostages if they think they need to in order to pursue their strategy of surviving the war. So number 1 goal. Number 2 goal was to dismantle Hamas's military and remove them from power in Gaza. Hamas no longer has a military. On October 8th, it had a vast military of over 5 brigades, 24 battalions, 40,000 fighters, 20,000 rockets, the ability to defend ground. That was a raid across the Gaza Strip. It no longer has a military. Does it have a guerrilla force? Yes. Does it have a lot of radicalized people who are willing to continue to fight? Absolutely. That's not the measure of effectiveness, though. Is Israel been successful at destroying Hamas's military? That's a fact. They absolutely have, and they are continuing that operation. The fact that the average age of a new Hamas recruit is 16 seems to escape people. Yes, there are new Hamas recruits.
So again, I hear him make this claim: the average age of new recruits is 16. Based on what? There's zero basis for this claim. There's not been a single piece of evidence to support this claim. And again, there's a lot of surveillance. IDF units have GoPro footage. We have drones. We're just not seeing combatants this age pick up arms in any significant way at all. We're not discovering it through open source research. We're not seeing a significant number of excess male 16-year-old deaths on the Ministry of Health list. It's just, it's a bullshit claim. There's zero basis for it whatsoever. And saying the average age of recruit is 16, it doesn't make any sense. Think about it. If the average age is 16, it means you have a significant number of 13-year-olds, 12-year-olds, 11-year-olds, only to get to the 16 average. When you have hundreds of thousands of able-bodied men who are ages 30 to 45. That average doesn't even make sense, nor is there any proof of that ever. And in fact, I don't think the only person I've ever heard make this claim is Spencer. I've never even heard Israel make that claim.
The other one is to remove.
Codes XBT says, I've seen enough children in mosque here holding guns. No, you actually haven't. You've seen a few social media posts that go viral. We're talking about a significant number. I don't think you were here when we review this, but you look at the available data, and there's only 1,800 more boys ages 13 to 17 than girls of those age. And we know males of all ages are dying at a high rate. If there's child soldiers, it's completely negligible. And obviously the average isn't 16. That just doesn't make any sense. There's no reason to believe that's true. That's just drinking the Kool-Aid with no basis.
Hamas from power, right? Hamas was the political apparatus that invaded and ordered its military, its terror army, to invade southern Gaza. Israel has attrited Hamas's governing capabilities. You have clans rising up. They're writing op-eds in the Wall Street Journal about, I am not Hamas. I am controlling southern parts of Gaza. Israel has been successful at taking the power from Gaza. Yes, it made missteps in the trying to wrest that main source of power. And there's new statistics out just yesterday about how much money Hamas has made since October 7th to pay its fighters by taking the aid. And then lastly, so 3 goals, if I'm not being clear: return the hostages, dismantle Hamas's military, remove them from power, and ensure that Gaza never threatens Israel again. And Israel has continued to establish a border area and expand that very difficult situation that was the border between Gaza and Israel since October 7th. So if somebody says there's nothing being achieved here, or there's nothing that has been achieved, they're just not right. That the idea that you should have stopped the war, right? So I heard somebody say, after the death of Yahya Sinwar, you should just ended it. There was no successes being made, and you were hurting Israel's reputation on the international stage. And you could talk about this ridiculous stuff about a 2-state solution and threatening Israel to stop the war. Again, take out the word Israel and take out the word Palestine. And just, if we were just to do this on paper, this is what happened on a country is invaded by a terror force. All these things happen. The other country waged war with these goals. We wouldn't be having this question of they're not achieving anything in this war. And the idea that you could do this in 21 months, again, that you could do this quickly under the constraints, right? Again, the United States and no other nation would have done it this way because they wouldn't have been forced to, right? 6 months of don't go into Rafah. You gave the enemy a safe haven. Now the enemy still has safe havens in Gaza City, where they have never evacuated. They have in Deir Blah and in the humanitarian zone that was forced to be made. Absolutely, Israel has the right to continue the operation, and all these double standards that it's being held to, it's still fulfilling, even though they're not right. So where does this go? Israel has to remove Hamas from power, not just for the safety of Israel, but for the safety of the Gazan people, to not be used as human sacrifices in the overall goal of Hamas, which has never changed, which is the destruction of Israel. I don't know if you saw recently how it thanked Keir Starmer about his threat to Israel and said, look, Britain, thank you for threatening Israel to recognize Palestine as a state in September, but make sure we're clear, we want Jerusalem to be the capital of that Palestinian state, and we don't want Israel to exist in it.
John, there are people who are going to say, look, by continuing this war, you're effectively playing into Hamas's hands. What Hamas wants.
So these are the war goals. Getting the hostages back, we got them back through negotiation. We've killed likely dozens through airstrikes, and we rescued 7 through military force. Yeah, you can make the claim that we got better negotiating terms because of military conduct, but it wasn't brute force that got them back. It was negotiation that got them back, and we could have gotten more back alive had we taken a different approach. We killed dozens and injured many others with our airstrikes, okay? All the hostages could have been back if that was our primary goal. That's not the primary goal. The primary goal is to remove Hamas from power. The chance of doing that has always been low. The cost has always been extremely high. But yeah, you can make the case that those who want Israel to continue, it's because they still believe Hamas will be removed from power. Most Israelis today are done with that narrative, and they say, no, let's just bring them home. We're done. It's time to bring our boys home. It's time to stop sending our soldiers to die. It's time to stop killing civilians. But yeah, if you do, if you know, the narrative, what John's saying, we need to continue until they're removed from power. Those who support the continued operation, this is what they want. Israel needs to continue until Hamas is defeated. But we're 2 years into this, and they still hold 40% of Gaza. The 60% that they don't technically hold, they still can maintain an insurgency. There's no clear plan for how to remove them from power. And that's why the public's lost trust. And the toll has just been immense. And there's really no end in sight. Now, let's see some comments. Somebody said, Google Palestine child holding guns and press images right now on stream and start scrolling down. Well, if I were to Google Jewish child holding gun, I'd see a bunch of Jewish children holding guns as well. In societies that are militarized and have a lot of guns, children like to pose with guns. It's something they do. So I could find you dozens of Gazan children holding guns. That doesn't mean they're combatants. The same way I could find you settlers holding guns, dozens and dozens of photos. That doesn't mean they're combatants. In militarized societies, you will always find photos of a child holding a gun because it's a cool thing to do. So no, that's not how you identify a child soldier. We have immense video and photo evidence. There's endless surveillance in Gaza. Show me children taking part in hostility. That's the evidence we need. Show it. Show it. We have Mideast Buka, who does a lot of open source research. He's pro-Israel. He found 3 instances of, I think it was 2 17-year-olds, okay, and 1 13-year-old who wasn't a combatant, he was a messenger. That's all he found in all his research. But if you want to prove that there's countless child combatants that are clearly not represented in the data, they're not found in photo and video evidence that's been made available, do some open source research, look at obituaries, try to find proof. People have done this. There's a massive incentive to find significant usage of child soldiers. We're not finding them. I don't say the things I say because I want them to be true. Everything I'm saying is based on the available evidence. I could be convinced. Show me evidence. I could be convinced. Right? Some things I say I'm making a moral argument, but when we talk about things like Hamas's use of civilian infrastructure and what that looks like, civilian to combatant ratio, use of child soldiers, stealing aid, all of this is dependent on available evidence. So I could be convinced of any of this, right? I just need evidence. So yeah, show me, prove it. Also, come on to debate. You know, I invite anybody who wants can come and join me for a live stream, make the case. Elon is asking Adar, how many have Israel killed? I mean, I think the estimate on civilian death toll is in the 100,000 range. That's a safe estimate. How many combatants? I think 10,000 is probably a safe range. Maybe we could say, you want to give a better range, you could say 8 to 15,000. 8 to 15,000 is a range. Let's see. Whatever. We'll do comments at the end. I see there's a lot of comments coming in. Damn, this is long. It's already. How much time do we have left? Okay.
Is to delegitimize Israel on the world stage, to make themselves look like the victims. They don't care how many people die, how many civilians die. In fact, for them, the more that die, the better, because the stronger it makes their position. And all Israel is doing by continuing this war is ultimately strengthening Hamas, plus the civilians that are in that area are going to be ever more likely to be radicalized the more their friends and their families die.
Yeah, it's a great question. And I heard, the great military theorist Dave Smith try to invoke insurgency math in this war, right? So the idea, again, counterinsurgency theory, where you have to protect the population because there's a small amount of enemy that are using the protection of being hidden within the population, and you need the population support, all of this, that you're creating more terrorists than you're killing. If somebody was to apply that math to war, then World War I, World War II, Korean War, there would be no war fought. If you have to take in the opinion of the enemy's population towards its support, right? If you look at Japan, if you would have polled the Japanese population during World War II, 100% would say, continue the war, the emperor is a deity, we will die for him. In war, against your enemies, the military and political apparatus, you are vicious against them. You deal with the radicalization of the population after you've achieved victory. And again, I go back to, if you're saying it's the costs have been too much, this makes Israel look too bad despite the facts, you should just stop. Then you're saying that anybody who repeats this sequence of the numbers game, the information operations campaign, the demonization of the military doing everything physically possible to protect civilians, then you're saying that, one, you want Hamas to stay in power in Gaza, and it is Hamas, not last year, today, that says, thank you, and we will rebuild, and we will continue to do October 7th attacks over and over and over again. That's a fact. That's what people are saying if you say stop the war now. Now, other people will say, like, oh, we agree, Hamas can't stay in power. Then what's your idea of how to do this differently? And this is, again, the last few people you've had, like, I don't know how to do this, but not this way. Like, well, I can show you how this has been done in any other war. Step one, remove the civilian population out of harm's way. There should be a global, where's the protest for Egypt? For Egypt to allow the civilians to get out of harm's way so that the killing of civilians that Hamas is putting in the way stops. None, not one. I really push back at this idea of Israel is only damaging itself by continuing the war. We wouldn't say that about anybody else in any other similar situation.
Yeah, but John, there's a big difference here. Forgive me for interrupting. There's a massive difference, which is Israel is a small country that relies on the support of its Western allies to be able to survive and function in a way that the United States doesn't have to recognize.
I actually appreciate Constantine and Francis giving good pushback. They don't understand the topic well enough to actually push back on all the misinformation. But when there's a fault in the logic, they are picking up on it and giving pushback. So I do appreciate them at least doing that.
With the reality, you can think that this is a public perception game, which doesn't matter to you as a military analyst, and I understand that perspective. But the reality is, if Israel, by pursuing this conflict in this way, alienates a whole generation of future Western decision makers, that will affect its survival over the long term. And I would argue that Israel is losing the PR battle in the West, and you are going to see people who are in their 20s and 30s today who are going to be making decisions about military aid to Israel 10, 15 years from now, who are being radicalized to an anti-Israel position by what they're seeing. And that is a reality that Israeli politicians have to reckon with, surely.
Absolutely. And this is, I will not deny that Israel hasn't lost the PR war. It never fought a PR war.
Right.
It's horrible at PR. And I'm pro-truth. So I'm telling you what I've learned from studying the war firsthand and interviewing these people, or how it compares to other situations, which is this, comparative analysis is a research methodology. But here's where I'll draw that line about it should matter. Absolutely. You can win every battle but lose a war. That's, Vietnam, you name it. That is absolutely the fact that I'm a military analyst because I study war, which means I factor in what is the political goal and what is the political context of the war. Again, the BB derangement syndrome is that it's just him. He has a lifelong history of or goal to strike Iran, which is rubbish. I mean, that's insane hyperbole and not true. The damage to the PR war, right? So if you think that because Israel is continuing the war in Gaza, it is detrimentally hurting its status as a nation. Okay, let's talk about what it did to Hezbollah, which is ridiculous of Piers Morgan to say, well, if it can do this to Hezbollah, why can't it do to Hamas? Like, that's just showing your ignorance on the complete context.
Well, give us that context. Explain the difference.
It's not a short answer, right? That's why these hosts want your 30-second talking
You've
points.
got time here. Explain it to us as long as you need.
Not you. Okay. Yeah, not you, right? So Hezbollah in southern Lebanon was a terror army with a nation, right?
I kind of feel like I'm done with this. I don't know if we're going to get anything more interesting. I mean, I'm sure there'll be a few more bits of misinformation, but it's getting late. Maybe we'll do some Q&A. If I missed any good segments that somebody wants me to review, send me a clip and I'll do it on another stream. There's only so much John Spencer I could take in an evening. And for those wondering, this is what the cops did to me yesterday at the Tel Aviv protest. It's a pretty nice battle wound, huh? I have another bruise on this temple as well, but not visible, just pain. Okay, we'll do like 20 minutes of Q&A and then we're going to wrap it up because it's almost it's going to be 1 a.m. by then. You're saying, why would Hamas not use children? They obviously don't care for their people. So full-grown adult men are better combatants. They're stronger, they're more fit. Generally, and we see this in many conflicts, you start seeing more child soldiers when you run out of adult soldiers. They're essentially the last resort. You're not nearly close to running out of readily available adults to take up arms against Israel if needed. So that's just one reason. But secondly, we're not seeing evidence of this, not photo or video evidence of this, but also when we look at the data of those killed, there's not all too many more boys killed than girls killed. So we're not seeing an excess. So you can make the claim that there's a significant usage of child soldiers, but then they're not being added to the list. So when we say that we have 18,000 confirmed deaths, we can know that those are almost entirely, if not entirely, civilians. If there's child soldiers, then you would need to factor that separately. But again, we should see evidence of this happening. And video photo evidence, non-existent. Open source research has identified 3, one of them who was a messenger. So again, could be convinced, but let's show evidence. And there's a rationale why they're not going to use child soldiers when they have many adult men who they can recruit. Which hostages has Israel killed? I have a list. This is who they've admitted to killing, okay? Where is it? I have so many notes here. Damn. Where is this? Okay, so Nir Bezar, Ron Sherman, Elia Toledano, Alexander Danzig, Yoram Metzger, Chaim Perry, Yogev Bushtov, Nadav Popwell, Avram Munder, they were all killed from carbon monoxide. When Israel uses these bunker busters for tunnels, they release carbon monoxide as a byproduct. So these were 9 deaths from carbon monoxide. We have Yossi Sharabi, who Israel admitted to killing in an airstrike. The Bibas family were most likely killed in an airstrike, although we know Israel's not admitting to that. But when you look at the available, I put out a review on this. I know this is controversial and people might not want to. I'm not going to go deep into this, but I could send you the analysis. most likely cause of death for Bibas was almost certainly an airstrike. And we also know that there's, hold on, what was her name? Noah something was killed in an airstrike. And then we have also 3 or 4 hostages that were released from Gaza and said that they were almost killed in an airstrike. And we just have a lot of people, a lot of the bodies that were returned dead, Israel never gave the cause of death. The only ones they gave the cause of death were for Bibas, because the whole world was waiting to hear. They really wanted to know. Very sensational, very easy to pit it on Hamas, helps the PR war. All the other ones, they very conveniently omit their cause of death. They just said they returned dead. But we've had dozens of bodies returned dead. The most plausible cause of death in Gaza of a hostage is an airstrike. The second most would be execution if the IDF is closing in, or it could be from injuries sustained on October 7th, or it could just be from if you're old and the malnutrition, that could kill you as well. But that's probably the order of likelihood of being killed, right? Hamas has a strong incentive to keep hostages alive because they're worth more alive. They're worth a lot more alive than they are dead. So they're not keeping them alive from the kindness of their hearts. They're keeping them alive just because they're much more valuable that way. But Israel's admitted to killing 12 already, but it's likely significantly higher than that. And just so you know, one of the reasons we also know that it's likely higher, we have a whistleblower report saying that the IDF was, in the weeks after October 7th, blowing up homes of hostage takers, even if they had intel that hostages might be there. They did say if we knew for certain hostages were there, we wouldn't blow up the homes. But the whistleblowers were saying it's likely that we were killing hostages in these airstrikes. Yellen, you're saying Gemini says Israel admits to 6. Okay, you shouldn't just rely on LLMs. That's a mistake. You should. There's a Haaretz article that says all the ones they admitted to. So ask Gemini to find you the Haaretz article. You'll need to translate it, but ask them to find you the Haaretz article, and they list all the ones and how we know this to be true, but it's more than 6. Okay. But again, Israel admits when they lose plausible deniability. They're not going to admit they killed their own if they don't have to. Right, so the instances with the carbon monoxide, they did because they return there's no visible wounds. They're found by other soldiers who get insight into their cause of death, and then it's not something that's easy to keep a secret anymore. When you're returned dead and you go straight to the morgue, there's not many people in on it, and it's much easier to just not give the cause of death. So the dead bodies that were recovered by actually the IDF on the ground, or if the families ask for autopsies, these are instances where they lost plausible deniability, and they're much more likely to admit it. The one interesting instance where 4 of those killed were found in a tunnel that was carbon monoxide poisoning, but they were also shot, which is interesting. Now, I did include those 6. The most plausible explanation to those who were shot and had carbon monoxide poisoning is that the tunnel was bombed. The militants tried to escape real fast, didn't want to leave them there, so just killed them. But what happened was, and this is how it's reported by the IDF, is they actually found the militants dead nearby. So the militants weren't able to escape. They tried to escape. They died of carbon monoxide poisoning. So they were shot, but that was after the tunnel was hit and carbon monoxide started filling it up. That's not the only explanation, but if you think through that scenario, that seems to be the most plausible. Okay, we'll wrap it. If anybody wants to do a super chat, we'll prioritize super chats. If not, we'll wrap it up in a few minutes. So, Code, you're saying there's a photo of Sinwar holding up a child with an AK-47. In the West, we call that child abuse. I mean, have you not looked at Israeli children? Type in Israeli children holding guns. There's plenty. Could you imagine if Hamas was killing children and then the propagandists were saying, oh, but look at these photos of them holding guns? Could you imagine? That's essentially what you're doing right now. We do that with a lot of things, right? We'll find a journalist that had a photo with some Hamas militant. We'll be, you see, they're in touch with Hamas. Okay, that doesn't make you a combatant. Oh, you see, they praised Hamas. That doesn't make you a combatant either. We have this standard that we apply to Gazan civilians that if it was applied to us, we wouldn't find it acceptable. So Sean is saying, you think IDF can withdraw and Hamas will just free the hostages? No. We've had a deal to get the hostages back since October 2023. There's been many different iterations of hostage deals to get them all home. It would require keeping Hamas in power, but there's been ways to get them all back. We've refused because we don't want to keep them in power. But our chance of defeating them has always been relatively low. It still remains low. So right now, Israelis finally understand that the chance of defeating them is low. So they're saying, let's just get them back. That's why we saw record levels of protests. And promise to live in peace, that's conditional to what happens next. We need to negotiate peace with them. It won't be an easy negotiation, but it's certainly possible. You have countless examples of terror organizations that had maximalist demands who made major concessions on their demands through negotiations. Hamas has made an effort to negotiate a truce with Israel on 4 or 5 occasions since the late 80s. We've rejected every single offer, and not just rejected, we refused to negotiate on these offers. There's this idea that you don't negotiate with terrorists, but no, that's exactly who you negotiate with them, because there's a long history of negotiating with terrorists and it being successful. I think the most relevant example is the PLO. The PLO is more extreme than Hamas, and now they're the PA, who we've had security cooperations with for decades, and they recognize Israel's right to exist in 93. So we've seen how we can take an extremist, maximalist Palestinian militant group and negotiate them to moderation. We've never attempted to do this with Hamas, ever. So it's not that they'll just promise to live in peace. It will require work, it will require concessions, but it's certainly within the realm of possible. So you have one option that is going down a path of peace, which there's no guarantee of success, but if you succeed, imagine what you succeeded. The other alternative ensures massive death and destruction, and also there's no guarantees of success. So there's 2 options and many iterations of these options. We have 2 options. Neither have a guaranteed success, but one is massive death and destruction, the other is not, right? So we should always exhaust the peaceful means before deciding that mass killing is okay. Mass killing should always be the absolute last resort. But today, and it's because we're wired this way, so not just today and all throughout history, we have this strong inclination to see violence as the first option and often the best option, when it should be the last option, and it's often not the best, it's often the worst option. So we need to, it's a shift we need in our psychology, in our institutions, in our way of looking at the world. Codes XBT says, you know what you didn't do, Adar? You didn't answer the question of what you think of a leader holding up a child with an assault weapon. Well, I think that's wrong. I think militant societies are harmful. We should strive to not have militant societies. So a leader that is supporting this is a bad leader. I have no issue saying that. Will Hamas ever accept a peace with Israel? Well, there's only one way to find out, and we haven't tried, and that's actually trying to negotiate peace with them. When they got elected in 2005, they reached out to Israel for a 10-year truce, and their leadership, some of their leadership said it could be extended to 20, 50, and even 100 years. And they asked for some demands we wouldn't agree to, but you often ask for extreme demands just to negotiate and meet in the middle. That's how negotiations work. We didn't attempt to negotiate this 10-year truce and then expand it to 20-year truce. Imagine a 20-year truce. That's a generation that doesn't even know what you don't even know what you're fighting over anymore. You extend that further, and you build ties. You build a shared economy. You don't give them a reason to want to take up arms. We've never attempted that with them. We've always, they have a maximalist view on us, but we've always had a maximalist view on them, saying, nope, there's no negotiation. So when they offered us a truce, our response was no, but we're going to put you under a brutal blockade. And hopefully it works itself out one day. That's been our approach. Maintain an immoral and unsustainable status quo, one that will always lead to more violence, and just hope that it works itself out. That's been our approach. Sean says, if you consider Tel Aviv occupied territory, then you're not interested in peace. No, I would say that is a false dichotomy. There are many Israelis who consider all the land to be Israel. They'd still be interested in peace. Maybe not peace on the terms you want. They could be negotiated with. Right, so this is another example of a double standard we have. Any Palestinian that considers Tel Aviv to be Palestine is an extremist. But an Israeli that considers all the land to be Israel, well, that's just normal. That's something worth reflecting on. Thought Radius says, Adar, why do Israelis keep talking and complaining about Palestinian education while Israeli education teaches children that we Palestinians have no connection to the land? I mean, both Israelis and Palestinians are pretty brainwashed, have a very narrow understanding and view of the conflict. They understand their side and their victimhood very well, but their perception of the other side is greatly distorted. And I'm not even sure most Israelis say there's no connection to the land. I don't think that's taught in schools. I actually think that's more of like a Western Hasbara argument, these cringe activists saying it. I feel like a lot of Israelis acknowledge Palestinian connection to the land. Yelin says, we won the war. All land had other people on it at some point. Okay, well, the Romans beat us, and for 2,000 years we tried to return. So excuse them, excuse the Palestinians for trying to return after 75 years. Maybe they learned a thing from us, or maybe just people with Levantine blood are stubborn and love the land and want to return. I'm not sure. But out of all the people in the world who shouldn't complain about stubbornness and wanting to return, it's us, because no one was more stubborn than us returning after 2,000 years. You say they can try and pay the price, but we also pay the price. And eventually they might succeed. Israel's survival is not guaranteed. This idea that we're invincible is just baseless. It's way overly optimistic. If we don't achieve peace, we very well may not survive the century, or even the half century. Time moves fast now. The next generation of Americans will be anti-Israel, meaning they're going to elect more anti-Israel politicians, which means we might not get vetoed with UN Security Council resolutions, which means we get sanctioned. A weakened Israel, who knows how our neighbors would respond to that. Arrogance will be our demise. Arrogance is why October 7th was successful. There was intel that it was happening. We thought, well, if it comes, we'll deal with it. We didn't know the scale of it, but arrogance will be our downfall. Yellen says we're achieving peace with all moderate Arabs. Yeah, what we're proving is that this idea that we can't have peace with our neighbors is not is not grounded in reality. We see that our past enemies are over time becoming our allies. The one thing holding a lot of the Middle East back from normalizing ties with Israel is the fact that we still haven't solved the Israel-Palestine conflict. So the best way to actually have peace in the Middle East, or at least for the Middle East to be at peace with Israel, is for us to find a just and lasting solution to Israel-Palestine. But we need to try. We're not trying. We've done very little in the grand scheme of things to actually solve the conflict. We've been more interested in maintaining a brutal status quo and expanding our territory, taking more and more land, continuing the exact grievance they still haven't forgiven us for. Sean says how, like, what is step one for peaceful normalization with Hamas? Step one is we now are in negotiations for a ceasefire. We could make it conditional that the ceasefire will be part of a greater negotiation for a permanent ceasefire. We can, again, Hamas has offered us multiple truces. We could sit at the negotiating table and try to get a 10-year truce with them, or even said, we don't want a 10-year truce. We want to negotiate a peace agreement. You'll have the establishment of a Palestinian state, but you will need to renounce violence and recognize Israel as a state. Get that process going. It's never been attempted. And right now we're in a situation where you could get the international community involved. You could get the Arab world involved. The Arab League has supported a two-state solution since 2002. They've offered it in the Arab Peace Initiative, I think on 7 occasions now, right? So there's the Middle East has changed. There's a lot of support for this. There's a way to achieve it. And if we don't want a two-state solution, then we need to find a just solution that includes Palestinians. Turn the land into a federation. Many different states where people have local autonomy, where there's equal rights, but where you don't have a system where we're competing over control over political and demographic control. There's different ways to do it. But when you don't give somebody peaceful means to achieve their goals, you're almost certainly ensuring violence, right? So we have for 100 years now imposed on Palestinians conditions that are likely to lead to violence, and then we respond to that violence by imposing more of those same conditions. We need to break this cycle and give Palestinians a clear path to achieve their political rights through peaceful means, and we don't do that. In fact, we do the opposite. The PA has been in cooperation with us for decades. We've kept them weak. We haven't given them a statehood. We've expanded and taken more territory. Hamas, when they were attacking us in Gaza, we withdrew. So what we told the Palestinians in doing so is saying, if you cooperate with Israel, we're going to expand. If you attack us, we'll retreat. We reinforce this idea that cooperation doesn't work and violence works. That's a huge mistake. We could change that. So there's plenty we could do. We've done very little in the grand scheme of things. Okay, I'm going to wrap it up. Thank you all for joining. Tomorrow I am going to Judea and Samaria, Palestine. There's this camping trip with 200 Israelis and Palestinians, and then I'll probably go visit. I'll either go spend the weekend in Ramallah, or I'll go to Nablus and visit Saluki. For those who, I imagine you all know Saluki. If not, check out his YouTube content. He does awesome shit. But we'll do some content together, or I'll be doing content from Ramallah. I'll probably do a live stream from there as well. And if anybody's here living on the land and you want to join this camping trip, send me a message. I think there's still some space, so we'd love to have you join. And with that, thank you for joining. Signing off from the Western Galilee. Sending you all much love.